How do my shoes look on the camera? Do they look
What do you
okay?
guys think about Sean's shoes? All right, so yeah, there is a code up there, or if you took the schedule, there's a code on that. You can scan it. It will text the right number, and then we will jump into these as best we can. One of the questions that was sent in that I think we all want the answer to, because you said we would, why is a rose beautiful?
Oh.
We skipped over that.
Okay. So,
objectively.
The argument for objective beauty is the same as the argument for objective morality. Here's the argument, and I'll flesh it out. This is from Peter Kreeft, a Catholic philosopher at Boston College. He said, there is the music of Bach, therefore God exists. You get it, right? No, you don't. Don't shake your head like you get it. He's being somewhat tongue-in-cheek. He's saying we all talk and act and believe as if objective beauty is a part of the world in which we live. You look at a waterfall, and what do you say? That is beautiful. You look at a sunset. You don't ask, is it, well, it's just my feelings. We talk about there's something inherent within the sunset itself that has the property of beauty. So in one sense, if you can't see that a rose is beautiful, the problem is not with the rose. The problem's with you. I'm dead serious. So think about this. If somebody says, well, prove to me that torturing an innocent child for fun is wrong, I'd say if you can't see that that's wrong, you don't need an argument. You need a therapist. We all know that a rose is beautiful, and we all act as if beauty is embedded within the world itself. Now, you might say, well, look, people differ over what is beautiful, and I'd say that doesn't mean there's no objective truth. People differ over historical claims. They differ over scientific claims. Nothing follows from the fact that people differ. Think about Scripture. Beauty in the garden, right? There's beauty in the natural world. There's beauty in the temple. There's beauty in the heavens. There's something transcendent about beauty that draws us out of ourselves. Isn't that, think about your experience when you look at a rose. What do you think? That's beautiful. Right? Is it a coincidence that in Beauty and the Beast they have a rose that is fading, symbolizing lost beauty? Nobody has to explain to us to try to understand what's going on in the movie. We understand that rose is beautiful and something petal by petal is being lost. So I would invite you to think about, how do we talk about beauty? How do we think about the world in terms of there being beauty? And we certainly all act and talk as if beauty is a real part of the world itself, in music, in a rose, in a sunset. That's the beginning. I could literally talk about this for hours. I think it's so fascinating. But classically, it's true that God exists, God is good, and God is beautiful. Psalms 105 says God is beautiful. So interestingly enough, the complaint against Christianity is, number one, that it's false. But now the complaint is that Christianity and Christian sexual ethic is harmful, it's bad. That's the argument, right? When I was a kid in the 90s, even if people didn't follow the Christian sexual ethic, there was a sense that it was a superior ethic that people probably should follow. Now it's bad and it's harmful. So I think we have to show people that a Christian sexual ethic is true, and it's good, and it's beautiful. How do we do that? Well, in some ways, think about the beach ball. Our culture is pushing down, saying that there's no such difference between men and women, but we all in our hearts know that there is. We yearn for a mom and we yearn for a dad. Can we model that to the world so they see the goodness and truth and the beauty of God's design for marriage? There's something beautiful about marriage. I better stop there. That was one question. Even if you're not convinced by me, so here's the deal. If you think I'm wrong, you stand against the majority of Western philosophy throughout the history of the world until 50 years ago. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Abolition of Man. Brilliant book. In the mid-1900s, he said there's a shift in Western culture. We used to look at a waterfall and say, that's beautiful. Now when we look at a waterfall and say it's beautiful, we think we're just talking about our own feelings. We'll leave it at that.
That's a great place to leave it. That was just the first question. So, all right, so there's a lot of questions coming in similar to this one. So kind of a two-parter. How do we know when we have arrived at a truth statement? We're working our way through a bunch of things. So how do we overcome things like cognitive biases or cultural upbringings and the distortions that they bring in our ability to arrive at a truth statement?
Okay, so how we know certain truths is going to vary and depend upon the discipline. So how you know something in science is going to be different than how you know something in history. That might be different than how you know something in math. That might be different than how you know something in theology. So when it talks in the abstract about how do we know something, we have to look at the kind of claim that's being made and justify it accordingly. So our Declaration of Independence says, all men are created equal. Now my mind is going blank. I should not have started there. It says these truths are what? Self-evident. What does that mean? When you reflect upon it, you just know it. So that a rose is beautiful, we just know it. It's self-evident. That torturing an innocent child for fun is wrong, that's self-evident. But when it comes to how we know theology, how we know science, how we know math, etc., it's not just self-evident. You have to do some work. Now, how do we limit our bias? I think there's a few things that we have to do. First off, realize that all of us are far more likely to be shaped by our biases than we realize. That's step number one. We all tend to think, well, I'm neutral, but those people, that political party, they're biased. That religion is biased. I'm like, nope, look in the mirror. We're all profoundly biased. The easiest person to deceive is ourselves. So we have to do some serious soul work. I do that a lot. I'm like, do I believe this because I want to believe it? Or do I believe it because the evidence is pointing in that direction? So if you've never changed your mind on something significant that costs you something, you're probably far more affected by your bias than you realize. You're probably believing things that are comfortable that you want to believe. That's a reality. So number one is just to realize how deeply we can be biased by things. Second thing is to read a lot of different sources and perspectives on issues. On every issue I write on, I get books all over the place. I listen to podcasts on multiple sides. So if look at your podcast feed. You don't have to do it, but if you want to know, like if you listen to podcasts, like I pull up and I'll just tell you a few that I listen to give you a perspective. I listen to the New York Times Daily. That's a really left political, for sure, biased news organization. And I enjoy Megyn Kelly, who's more libertarian, not a Christian, but a little bit more conservative. I like to listen to both to make sure I'm not just believing what I want to believe. If I showed you my podcast on a lot of issues, you would see multiple perspectives. So read and study people of different perspectives. And then the third thing, how do you know you're not just biased, is present your arguments to somebody. Hey, here's what I think. What holes do you see? What am I missing? Because oftentimes it's somebody who has a different perspective that will point things out and push and prod and help us see things that we don't see. So recognize your weakness, study a lot of different perspectives, present your case to people and ask them, what am I missing? What do you think? Is this a good argument? And then when it's all said and done, I like to ask myself, am I just having integrity in what I believe? Or am I just believing what they're telling me to believe, and is that just comfortable? I try to have an integrity issue as best I can on views that I hold. So that's it. But you can't study every issue today, right? I also look for people that I think have integrity in their scholarship and their presentations. I try to listen to people that I think are going to give me multiple perspectives that care about truth more than they care about their own perspectives. There's an atheist by the name of Coleman Hughes. He's libertarian, and he's brilliant. He had a guy in there who was arguing from the other perspective. He didn't get defensive. He didn't get angry. He just listened. And I thought, wow, he really wants to know if he's wrong and really wants to believe what is true. I thought, wow, I might disagree with him on a lot of issues, but I actually think he cares about truth. And I try to find people that I think really care about truth and follow them as sources. That's the best we can do.
Yeah, so within that, where do you think like self-cross-examination fits in? Like how often do you say, okay, I've been talking about this issue a lot, I've been thinking a lot about this issue, this is what I think I believe, and so then do you spend a lot of time or any time, or would you recommend even spending the time even cross-examining yourself, like trying to poke holes before you even present it to somebody else?
Yes.
And so so like if you're gonna present like a new book or speak in front of 400 people, how much and how important do you think that is, even on an individual basis, for us to cross-examine ourselves? And how would you go about it?
I can answer for myself on this one. James 3 says, woe to those who teach. Now you're like, well, Sean, you're a teacher, that's your job, you're on stage, but all of you are teaching somebody. Maybe it's in a Bible study, maybe it's your kids, maybe it's a friend. That applies to all of us in different ways. That verse kind of haunts me. Like, whoa, beware, don't teach. You're going to be held accountable. Like, it goes through my mind a lot. People will actually listen to what I say and think it's true just because I say it. I'm like, wow, that's bad. People shouldn't do that, but they will. So I feel that way. It's a constant running dialogue through my mind. Is that true? Did I get that right? Did I miss something? It's constant for me. But the more important the issue is, the more I try to think about it, given what's at stake. And for me, I try to stay and speak in my lane. There's a lot of things, if you're like, Sean, tell me about the economics report for this month and the jobs, I'd be like, I got almost nothing for you. I'm not an expert in that. That's not my lane. So I try to qualify what I say based on how true I think it is and how much research and thought I've put into it. That's what I try to do.
So how important do you think it is for people in general to like pick a lane and run in it? Because we can't all think about everything all the time. Some of us try to, and we do really badly. We think poorly about everything instead of well about a few things.
That can happen. Well, I just say a lane because I'm a communicator. It's my job. I write books and I speak. I have a YouTube channel. Like, I have certain lanes I speak into. So you don't necessarily have to have a lane like that if that's not your job, in a sense. But the scriptures are full of like having sound doctrine. It's full of the importance of biblical beliefs. So this is true for all of us, even if we have different platforms. Ideas matter. They have consequences.
Yeah, no, that's great. When we get back to the idea of maybe people are confused about having an objective morality that is actually subjective. So someone asked, what if someone responds that the moral law finds its truth, its objective truth in the government or the law, the democratic process?
Okay.
And it's true because of the commonly held belief. That seems like an ice cream argument masked as an insulin argument.
Okay, so if somebody says to me, morality comes from the government, or it comes from the majority of beliefs. Here's a question I would ask them. Is there ever a justification for a moral reformer? What is a moral reformer? Somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., who says the majority opinion and the government is wrong. If you take this argument, you can never have a moral reformer who comes and says, maybe we shouldn't have slavery. Maybe we shouldn't have these Jim Crow laws. Maybe we shouldn't have child sacrifice. Maybe we shouldn't have fill in the blank. By this argument, you can never have a moral reformer. And I doubt most people are going to go along with that. If morality is, look, don't confuse what is legal with what is moral. Something can be moral and illegal. Something can be legal and immoral. So if morality comes from the government, then governments can never be wrong. They voted the Nazis into power in Germany to kill the Jews. That was legal. Are you okay with that? That's what I would ask. If government determines right and wrong, then anything a government ever does is justified. So if this argument is made from somebody who's, say, on the LGBTQ side, give an example, I would say, okay, so if in Iran they decide to throw gay people off and kill them because the majority of people believe that homosexuality is wrong and the government ruled it in, are you okay with that? Then there's no chance, if they're being honest, they're going to say it's okay. Does that make sense? So this is what's called reductio ad absurdum. You take somebody's argument and you draw it out to its absurdity. So if somebody says morality is based in the government, then I'm going to come up with a counterexample that they're not going to accept. The Holocaust, justified by the government. Pretty sure you don't want to justify that. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And a follow-up question along the line of kind of the government kind of legislating morality, as it were, or attempting to. There's a lot of people in here who are public school teachers or have kids in public schools. There's this conflict that parents feel or that the teachers in the classroom feel when they hear a student make a claim like, I'm a boy, but really I'm a girl, or I want certain pronouns, or they just say any truth that contradicts, or make a truth statement that contradicts the truth of Scripture. How would you, to the best of your ability, you're not a counselor, you're not in that lane, but do you just encourage people to try to say the politically correct answer, or how would you encourage somebody in a public school setting to stand up for truth?
Okay, so it depends on the public school setting. A teacher is going to be very different than how I would counsel a student, right? So whenever you answer these questions, you got to think of the sphere. Is it in business? Is it with a neighbor? Is it at church? Is it in a public school system, et cetera? So a teacher, I don't envy. My wife taught in a public school for years, and now she's teaching at a private school. I understand some of the tensions and dynamics that are there. So if I was teaching a public school, I would find other Christian public school teachers and lock arms with them. I would try to find a principal in particular and see what kind of support and leeway that you have. There's an organization called Gateways to Better Education that specifically equips public school families and teachers with their rights in the public school. And you have more rights and freedoms than you think. So the first thing you really got to do is educate yourself. It's called Gateways to Better Education. I did their fundraiser last year. I was so impressed with religious rights, with other freedoms that you have in a public school. And frankly, if you step out, there are a lot of lawyers like in the ADF who would be willing to come defend and take your case. I know that's not fun and why you got into teaching, but at some point, we cannot violate our consciences. And it's increasingly moving towards that direction. So lock arms with other Christian school educators and educate yourself through Gateways for Better Education. Is that the question? I could talk about parents or how I would navigate with students. I want to make sure
I think that's really helpful for the public school teachers. I think that's kind of the heart of the question. So,
okay.
Yeah, I think that's good. A lot of questions have come in on what do you think are some of the cultural developments over the last 25, 50, 100 years that have kind of led us to the cultural moment that we find ourselves in right now, with a lack of respect for the truth, the total embracing of all sorts of disordered worship and lifestyles and all of that.
Okay, so this is an interesting question. It's a huge question. Carl Trueman has written a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And he says, how did we get to a cultural moment where somebody can say, I'm a boy trapped in a woman's body? And people think that's like a logical, sound thing to say, when our grandparents are like, what on earth are you talking about? He traces it back to the 16 and 1700s. I won't tell that whole story right now, but you're right to say 10, 20, 100 years. A lot of what we're experiencing right now is the result of ideas of what it means to be human. For example, a Freudian idea, Sigmund Freud, is that you at your core are a sexual being. The truest thing about us is our sexual desires, our sexual identity. Marx said we're economic beings. Freud said we're sexual beings. So your identity is really rooted in your sexual attractions. Can you see that idea roughly a century plus ago really come into fruition in our culture today? Then you move to certain people like William Reich wrote a book called The Sexual Revolution. And he said the reason there's neurosis, the reason there's problems in society like mental illness is because of sexual repression. So we are sexual beings. We're made to live out our desires unhindered. And when we can't do so because of bigoted folks like you and me and you folks in religion who say no to certain sexual behavior, that's what causes neurosis. That's what causes suffering. That's what causes problems. He argued that in the early 1900s in Germany, a century ago. So there's a long story. You look in the romantic movement and the poets, it's like get in touch with nature, live by your emotions and your feelings. Can you see how these different ideas are kind of coming to fruition today? So there's a whole history of ideas, I think, that have gotten us here. I think another piece of the story is technology. Things like technology have moved forward the sexual revolution. There's no doubt that things like the pill radically changed society. Roughly speaking, somewhat crude, if a guy wanted to have sex with a girl in the past, he had to greatly risk getting her pregnant. Hence, it really encouraged marriage. Now, with technology, you can have sex without babies and you can have babies without sex. So we've completely severed creation from sexuality and human identity. Technology like pornography, that's a whole story in itself. In many ways, we have a pornified generation that what they think about pleasure, what they think about relationships has been profoundly shaped by the technology of pornography. So if you want to know how we got to where we are today, this is a huge story of thinkers like Freud, thinkers like Reich, thinkers like Marx, even thinkers like Darwin, who said we don't have a fixed essence, we have an evolving, changing essence. All of these ideas over literally centuries in some ways are culminating today in some of the challenges that we face. You add that with technology, and you can kind of begin to understand the cultural moment that we are at. I don't know if that's exactly what they're looking for, but I'll tell you one other shift is, this is so interesting to me, is I had a chance with my dad, who's spoken here at least a couple times. If you don't recognize the name Josh McDowell, that's my father. He is 84 years old. I told him recently, I was like, man, Dad, you're old. When God said, let there be light, you flipped on the switch. And he goes, son, when I started ministry, the Dead Sea was only sick. He's got a great sense of humor. My dad was born in 1939. My grandpa, 1898, interestingly enough. Anyways, my dad grew up in a broken family background. He was actually sexually abused for 7 years. This is in the 40s. Nobody talked about it and believed him when he told them. His older sister committed suicide. His dad was the town drunk. Set out to disprove Christianity. Ended up being compelled by the evidence, drawn by the love of God, became a Christian. Wrote his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, in 1972. Considered one of the most significant books of the 20th century. We updated it together in 2017. And so I got to ask my dad a lot of questions. How has culture shifted? Because he's spoken on more university campuses than I think anybody in world history. Like over 1,200 university campuses. It's crazy. Millions of students. And he said one of the shifts is, like in the 60s and 70s, there was a sense that the problem was out there. Like during the Vietnam War, we were protesting problems in the world that are out there. Now it's shifted in here. Now there's an obsession with mental health and my feelings and my identity. And I think he's right about that. So in the church, if we frame come to Jesus to make somebody feel better, get better mental health, help them personally, that might help them personally, but that's not actually the gospel. There's temptations to frame the gospel in a way to make it palatable to the way this generation thinks that ends up compromising what the gospel actually is. So we have to be aware of that shift, but not shift so much that we lose the nature of the gospel itself. But I actually think that when my dad said to me, he goes, we used to see the issue was out there. So when he would speak on college campuses, 60s, 70s, 80s, really in the early 90s, he'd make a case for the resurrection. People would say, that's not true. Give me some evidence. I don't believe you. Prove it. There was an assumption that truth exists, an assumption we should follow it, an assumption that we can know truth. We just debated over what it was. Now that's intolerant. That's bigoted. What right do you have to say that? Is how many people respond. And in the back of their minds, it's not just that Christianity is false, it's that Christianity is harmful and Christianity is not good. Those are some of the huge shifts over the past. So it's moved from objective to subjective. It's moved from the big objections being Christianity is false to Christianity is harmful. Those are probably two of the biggest shifts I think we've seen culturally speaking.
Yeah, and you mentioned Carl Trueman's book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's an excellent read, but then he had in the foreword of his book, Strange New World, he said he had a friend who read the book and said, great, Carl, write it for regular people.
That's true.
Because unless you were like an Ivy League academic who understood most of the words that he used in it, it's just this giant tome that nobody
it's not
really
that
wants
bad.
to read.
It's big, but it's not like it's
I'm
readable.
just quoting
it's
the
just
foreword
huge.
that he wrote. He called it too much. His friend
It's
called
long.
it too much. And so he rewrote it as a book called Strange New World. So if you want to read the Cliff Notes of Rise and Triumph, get Strange New World. It's an excellent read. It's a quicker read.
I agree. That's a great
And so
tip.
that's a great resource, as is Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So there's a lot of parents in here. You're a parent. You have kids that are into their teens. A lot of us who are over 30, we're kind of digital immigrants, as it were. We grew up in a world where cell phones were either bricks or non-existent. We had dial-up internet and all of that stuff. And now we have kids that have never known a life without iPads and streaming things. My kids the other day saw a VCR, and they're like, what is this contraption? And I was like, oh, no, I'm old. But with all of the extra access to technology, there's tons of access to all sorts of information, misinformation, truth, opinion, and there are all sorts of algorithms designed to target our kids on these various devices, whether it's a streaming service or a cell phone. So as a parent, how do you think about technology and how your kids are either exposed or how you protect them from certain things and their approach to it, and how do you talk through maybe some of the truth claims that they come up against as they encounter them via technology?
This is a great, huge question. Probably 2 or 3 years ago, I wrote a blog. I titled it like, I gave my son a phone at 14 and a half. And you're like, why 14 and a half? I'm glad you asked. So one thing, I think my parents did a lot of things well, but my parents never said when you turn 16, you can get a driver's license. When you turn 16, if we feel that you're responsible enough to drive a car safely, then you can get your license. And my dad's thinking was, I'm not going to give over power that I have into your life. So for me, I don't tell my kids you can get a smartphone when you're 12 or 13. Our first 2 kids, we've told them the earliest you could get it is at 13. with certain limits and protections built into it we could talk about. We made a contract, we had them sign and everything. I said, but number one, you got to get your grades up. Got to make sure you're just like characters in your life that we can trust you and you're helping around home. And if so, you can get a smartphone. But we're going to check a lot of the stuff that you use. You're not going to have it in your bedroom. You're going to turn it in a certain time at night, and we're going to check. And my son got it. We took it back for a while, gave it to him, took it back. It was a process of just like mistakes and letting go. I think the reason why we give kids smartphones is because we don't want to fight the battles. It's easier, isn't it? I didn't enjoy being told, Dad, you're the worst. All of my friends have smartphones. You and Mom are so strict. I mean, even this friend, her parents are so strict, she has a smartphone. My daughter in 8th grade was one of the few in her classroom that had a smartphone. I would probably push it later if I had another daughter. But you've got to fight certain battles, and you got to be willing to do it. So, and be on the same page with your spouse. That's navigating that. You got to have clear boundaries. When kids are younger, it's like turning your phone at 8. My daughter's almost 17 now. I think she turns it in at 10. But she doesn't keep it in her room. When we get in the car, do not get on your smartphone. We're going to talk and be together. Don't pull it out at the dinner table. Like there's just certain reasonable things that at least I think they're reasonable, that we try to work in. That's one thing. The other thing is just the effect of smartphones on making kids think and see the world because of the endless information. Honestly, I think TikTok is a cesspool. I have a TikTok account, partly because that's where people are communicating and talking, so I put content on there. But I'm not going to let my 11-year-old get it potentially for a while. And if we do, it'd be a limited amount of time. We would watch some together and just talk about it. Anybody can have access to TikTok. And frankly, some of it is manipulated by the country behind it that owns it. And so, I'm not a conspiracy guy. I think when you look at people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, who would not give their kids these kind of smartphones, that kind of tells you something about the people in the know. So have boundaries, be willing to be told. I mean, you can't have completely ridiculous boundaries. Obviously, there has to be somewhat of a compromise. Be willing to fight those battles because our smartphones are discipling kids. I'm more worried about what comes through a smartphone affect my kids than I am Richard Dawkins and his atheist arguments. I'm more worried about the subtle lies about materialism, about sexuality, about identity. Those are the things that concern me more. So we talk with our kids a decent amount about it. Show videos, hey, what do you think? And we have ongoing conversations about it. And we start those conversations early. So does that help? I mean, I could keep talking more things that we do. I don't know. I know tomorrow we're going to have some kind of parenting session specifically.
Yeah, we're going to get a little bit more into parenting tomorrow afternoon. I want to shift to a question that actually came in from a 6th grader that's here. And so it's an opportunity to speak to someone who is really of the next generation here. And so or he or she, I don't know, they didn't say. What would you do if in a public school setting, you're in 6th grade, someone tells you, I'm LGBTQ+. You know, they come out to you, or how would you encourage a young 6th grader to respond?
Okay, first off, I just love that you're a 6th grader, that you're here. Second, I love that you asked this question. And third, I love that you have a heart for your other classmates who presumably don't know Jesus. Good for you. Here's the first thing I would do. Maybe not the first thing, but priority first thing. Make sure you tell a parent or a youth pastor that you're having these conversations. So you can just navigate that with them. If you didn't respond the way you wanted to, give yourself some grace. That's okay. Go tell a parent, an older sibling, go tell a youth pastor, and they can be aware of this. They can navigate it with you. They can help you. If you're in 6th grade, you're presumably about 12 years old. My son's 11 in 5th grade, and he cannot possibly navigate this himself. So tell somebody. If this happens to you. The other thing you can say to the person is you can say, thanks for telling me. Tell me about that. When did you start identifying this way? How have people treated you? I'm curious why you told me. And really, this is a human being made in God's image who's probably trying to fit in, wants to be liked, is probably seen, are you going to respond in a gracious way? Try to be a friend to this person. That's probably the best advice I could give you. Make sure you tell a leader to process this and just think about it and be a good friend to this person. I think that's what Jesus would have you do. I can't speak for everybody who's LGBTQ, but I know there's an awful lot who just kind of feel like outsiders, which feels strange given where our culture's going, feel like they don't fit in, they're struggling with their identity the way everybody who's 12 is. Just be a friend of this person. Wow, thanks for telling me. Want to go play chess? Want to go shoot pool? Let's go play some basketball. Literally, just be a friend of this person. Or you maybe don't shoot pool. I don't know what you do. Weird. You get the point. Tell an adult and just try to be a friend to this person the way you would want somebody to be a friend to you.
Yeah, that's great. We have another question from a 6th grader. So
amazing. Or an adult who's posing as a 6th grader
because
I'm
they know that that's the ticket.
2 in a row, man.
So the 6th grader is wondering, how can we know that Jesus is the truth? How can we know? How do we anchor the gospel as truth?
I love that question. I would say a couple things. I would say, number one, the powerful transformation and change in the lives of believers points to the truth. 2 days ago, I just did an interview. It went longer than normal, went 90 minutes. A former Salafi radical Muslim. He went from Muslim to atheist to deist to Christian to New Age to Christian, to like real Christian. And he describes in there supernatural dreams and visions he has of Jesus showing up to him, and it turned his life around. What was so interesting about this is at the beginning, the video is called From Jihad to Jesus. And he was so afraid of Allah that he was going to die in a jihad. It was the only way he knew that he could go to heaven. He said, I had no fear of death, but I had a fear of God that he would send me to hell. He said, I became an atheist. I had no fear of God, but I had fear of death because this life is all I had. Last question in the interview, I said, now that you're Christian, do you fear death? He goes, Sean, I don't fear death. Anybody who's watching this, all I ask is you read the Bible first and ask yourself, who is Jesus? And then you can kill me. And I was like, dang, that is boldness of somebody who's laying down their life. So to this person, I would say, and I could give you incredible stories of people like my dad, able to forgive his dad who sexually abused him because God transformed his heart. That's one way. So if you're not sure if Christianity is true, read the Gospel of John and ask yourself, and in 6th grade, you can do this. Why did this person, Jesus, why has he influenced more governments, more lives, more art, music, history, every component of history more than anyone who's ever lived? Why is this person, Jesus, literally turned the world around so much that our calendar reflects his birth? So number one, the changed lives of people. Number two, just read the Gospel of John and ask yourself, who is this person, Jesus, that has so radically turned the world upside down that more people call themselves followers of him than anyone who's ever lived? Third, you can actually look at the evidence tied to Jesus. So if we look at this question historically, we know that Jesus lived. We have not only the gospel accounts, we have ancient writers like Josephus, a Jew, Tacitus, a Roman. We know Jesus died by crucifixion. We have the gospel accounts. We have the letters of Paul. Again, Josephus, a Jew, Tacitus, a Roman. We know Jesus lived. We know he died. We also have very good reason to believe the tomb itself was empty and the body is gone. How do we know this? There's at least 21 arguments for this, but I'll give you one. What's fascinating is in all 4 Gospels, who discovers the empty tomb? The women do. In that culture, a woman's testimony was considered far less significant than a man's. It was patriarchal. So if the gospel writers are inventing a story about an empty tomb and wanted to convince their audience that it was true, who's the least likely person they would invent? Women. Yet all 4 Gospels write that because women actually discovered the empty tomb. Jesus lived, he died, the tomb was found empty. And then 4th, you have all these people who said they saw the risen Jesus. You have the apostles, you have the 500, you have the women, you have Thomas like doubters, you had James, the brother of Jesus, who was not a believer during his lifetime, and you have the apostle Paul. And they were willing to suffer and die for their belief they had seen the risen Jesus. So I think we can know Christianity is true by the changed lives, by the power of the gospel, and simply looking at it through a historical lens. There's no other explanation that can account for all the details of Jesus in the way that the story told he actually resurrected does. So that's the somewhat quick answer as a 6th grader. I would give you a copy of the book my dad wrote. I updated with him called More Than a Carpenter. If you're in 6th grade and if you want to know if Christianity is true, that's a quick book. It's like you can read it in like 2 or 3 hours. Read that book and talk to a leader about it because that'll help you understand with confidence that Christianity is objectively true.
I have to turn the mic on for it to work. We actually just at our Welcome Center, we give away copies of More Than a Carpenter to every new person that comes in. So that's the book that we give all new people.
Amazing.
So if you're in 6th grade and you want a copy of it, just come talk to us at the Welcome Center. Not this weekend because we ran out and we've ordered more, but in a few weeks when they come in, if you're middle school, high school, we'll get you a copy of the book. We'll make it happen. So
all right,
let us know.
I've never done this before. I'll make a promise to you. If you're in 6th grade and you're not sure, and the one who sent this message in that Christianity is true, if you get More Than a Carpenter and you actually read it, I will Zoom with you for at least 30 minutes if a parent comes with you and do my best to answer any further questions that you have about Jesus. Now, I don't want to get on Zoom. Some old guy goes, you know what? I faked this. I just want to hang out. I will not be happy. I'm a busy guy. But if you're in 6th grade and you really have questions about whether it's true or not, read the entire book. You've got my information. Give me theirs. I'll reach out. I'll contact you. We'll set up a Zoom, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. If you remind me, I was that 6th grader who read More Than a Carpenter at the church, I will remember, and we'll do it. That's my commitment to you.
Great.
That'd be fun.
That's great. All right, we have time for 2 more questions. One that came in, I'm sure this doesn't surprise you, but it doesn't surprise me, is people really want to know, how much can you bench?
Honestly, I got to think about this. When I was like 38, 39, I was determined I was going to bench 300 when I turned 40. It was just a fun goal. Then my elbows started hurting. And I was like, why am I doing reps with 200 plus? And I was like, what's the point? I don't need to prove anything to anybody. So I don't know any pounds I can bench press. Honestly, I don't care. I really don't. There's no chance I'm going to max out. All it takes is one injury, and then I'm down for years at my age. Do you want me to guess?
The people want you to guess.
I bet I could still do 265, maybe 270.
Wow.
If I had a guess. That's a guess. You've been heckling me all night, man. You and this guy over here.
Yep. Well, if we want to actually saw Pastor Dan buy a weight bench in the parking lot from somebody through a Facebook swap right before this, so we could probably make it happen here in a little bit. But, so the last question that we want to tackle tonight, there's been a lot of questions, especially as it relates to gender and sexuality and all sorts of things. We're going to get to more of those tomorrow. There's a lot more, there's at least 2 more extended Q&A times happening tomorrow. So we'll get to a lot of them, and I expect more will come in. As it relates to truth and truth claims, how would you encourage a Christian to engage with a so-called progressive Christian who really believes that ever-evolving quote doctrine is true? So the church has moved in a direction where they can be affirming, or they deny the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. Like, there's all sorts of doctrine that progressive Christians are rejecting and embracing, or new ones that they're embracing as true. How would you encourage a Christian to faithfully engage?
So the first thing you have to do is ask somebody, what do you mean by progressive Christian? There's some people that use that moniker that I think still hold on to an orthodox faith, but use that term. There's a lot of people who define themselves as progressive Christians who have completely left the farm of orthodox Christianity, in my estimation. Now, if you're not sure what progressive Christianity is, I've had a couple of conversations on my YouTube channel with self-proclaimed progressive Christians. Maybe some of you have seen this. And keep in mind, I'm not running a church, I'm a professor, and YouTube is a certain medium. So I have a certain kind of conversation that might be different than we would potentially have here. And both of these guys I really like. One of them, his name is Brandon Robertson. He has a huge following on TikTok, big following on social media. I think he has a YouTube channel. And we had a conversation, and he basically argues that Jesus sinned. Exactly right. Argues that Jesus sinned, rejects the Trinity. Like, there are certain fundamentals that I think he has left behind. I had another conversation with a fellow who wrote a book called The Shift that went from kind of conservative evangelical to progressive Christian. I've had 2 conversations. His name is Colby Martin. He's a pastor in San Diego. And I just asked him questions. I'm like, is the resurrection literal or metaphorical? He goes, if you listen to my sermons, some years it's literal, some years it's metaphorical. In other words, in his mind, the resurrection is an optional doctrine to believe as being grounded in history. I think 1 Corinthians 15 is crystal clear that the resurrection is an essential belief to the faith. He said the Bible's inspired, but he also said so is the basketball playing of LeBron James. I was like, if you had said Jordan, you would have had me, but I digress. Now, do you understand what he's saying? Like, great writing is inspired, but not authoritative, inspired within itself. So the progressive Christian movement, people aren't going from atheists to progressives. That's not how it works. They're leaving conservative evangelical Christianity and becoming progressive. And one big reason is not only, but many times you see a lot of hurt that's there, church hurt and abuse and broken relationships and legalism that drives some towards that. I think many adopt a cultural narrative, and in many cases on LGBTQ issues, and start to think if you're not affirming, you're not loving, and therefore shift. I think there's a shift in biblical authority. So I'm not afraid to have conversations with atheists, with agnostics, with skeptics, progressive Christians, because I know what I believe. I have a PhD and I have 2 masters. This is my job. But I also know there's a lot of progressive Christians who are trying to talk fundamentalist Christians, like especially younger Christians, out of their faith towards a progressive kind of faith. That's where I would just say we should have conversations with people, but be wise and be careful and be discerning. A lot of it depends upon your maturity, your spiritual maturity, your biblical understanding. If you're going to go back and talk with somebody else and run it off of them, doubt is a powerful thing. When somebody starts putting doubts in your mind, it can really affect you. So if you have somebody who's, I want to be careful how I cash this out because we should talk with human beings. We should build relationships with people who see the world differently. I want to encourage that. But I also want to be protective. Many progressive Christians have ideas and have agendas and want to talk you and I out of our beliefs. And I want to say, be careful and be wise and be discerning in doing so. I used to take my students, I try to think of what's the most godless secular place I could take my students to, like what university? So we've been going to the University of Iowa. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. I am so kidding on that. Half of you will not. Should I have said Iowa State? I don't know the difference between the two. I don't know where that would have landed me. But we actually we take students to Berkeley. High school students, junior high students. And we bring in some gay activists, we bring in atheists, we bring in agnostics, Unitarians, have them speak to our students. But I would train my students carefully how to interact with and engage those with a different worldview. So we should read books of people who see the world differently. We should have conversations with people who see the world differently, but not flippantly. And we've got to have the right relationships and spiritual grounding to do so. Does that make sense? But if you do, ask a lot of questions, listen to their story, show sympathy, and just aim for clarity. That's a lot of the kind of conversations that I have. So,
that's great. That's great.
Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate your time here, and I know we've gone a little bit over. I want to give you a minute here you have a couple books for sale out there, and we are giving away one of yours. If there's anything you want to tell us about them so that either we can buy them or know more when we pick up the book, kind of what to expect.
Sure. So on that last topic, interestingly enough, my most recent book is called Set Adrift, Deconstructing What You Believe Without Sinking Your Faith. Now, by deconstruction, people mean different things. What we mean is assessing our beliefs and making it more faithful to Jesus and the Scripture, and shedding away things that are cultural and traditional, not biblical. So how do we have a more biblical, Jesus-focused faith? So this book is written, you might say, I went through a real period of questioning in my life, and I had some mentors and apologetic books that helped me understand that Christianity was true. But then I had a mentor who kind of came beside me and asked me certain questions, guided me to think about my beliefs, and kind of took me on a journey to own my own faith. Evidence That Demands a Verdict is the apologetic book over here. Set Adrift is more this book. So for a young person or any adult who says, I'm trying to help young people figure out what they believe and kind of guide them through, this would walk you through how to do that well. Because there's a phenomenon of people just bailing on their faith today. How do we have good conversations? How do we really separate what's cultural from what is true? That's the root of Set Adrift. Basically, it's the book I wish somebody had given me when I was 19 and 20 years old, going through doubt. So one of the books I'd recommend to students. This book, probably get into tomorrow, called So the Next Generation Will Know, wrote with a friend of mine, former atheist, cold case detective, J. Warner Wallace. And this one's written for parents, Christian educators, grandparents, and youth pastors. Basically, anybody who says, I'm concerned about reaching the next generation. This is a how book. What are some practical tools for passing on your faith to the next generation? And really quickly, do you want to know what all the research shows if you want to pass on your faith? 3 things. Number 1, you have to model a compelling faith. Number 2, build relationships with your kids. Number 3, have meaningful spiritual conversations. Those 3 things the research shows are the most significant in passing on your faith. And we walk through really how to do that, and so the next generation will know. So those are the books that are out there.
Great. Great.